Montana Territory, April 1872. The wind screamed through the pines as Madelyn Vance stumbled down the ridge, her skirts torn, her breath shallow, her arms wrapped tight around the tiny bundle pressed to her chest. The baby whimpered, a soft sound against the cold night, and she tucked him in closer, whispering, "Just a little farther, Oliver, just a little more." Behind her, the sharp crack of a rifle rang out. She dropped to her knees, heart hammering, but the shot was far too far uphill. They had not seen her. Not yet. She forced herself up and kept moving, one boot sinking into mud, the other scraping rock. Her fingers bled, her lungs burned, but she did not stop. She could not. Not while he was still out there. Not while her baby's father still hunted her like a man starved. By the time she reached the valley floor, dawn was breaking. The sun lit the distant fields in gold where fence posts lined up in neat rows, and cattle grazed quietly past a wooden barn. Smoke curled from the chimney of a small, weather-worn house. She stared at it, swaying on her feet. Then she saw him. He stepped out from the barn, tall and broad-shouldered, a buckled gun belt hanging loose on his hip. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbows, arms dusted with hay and dirt. He paused mid-step when he spotted her. His hat shadowed his eyes for a moment, then he moved fast. Madelyn's knees buckled. She fell just before he reached her. When she woke, the baby was crying, her hands shot out, panic rising, but strong arms steadied her. "He's safe," the man said, voice low, steady. "You both are." She turned her head slowly. He was beside her, seated on the edge of the narrow bed. The inside of the house smelled of wood smoke and coffee. The baby Oliver lay bundled in a clean blanket in a wooden cradle by the hearth. "You passed out cold," he said. "Had to carry you in." "Sorry if it scared you, miss." She blinked at him, trying to take in his face. He had kind eyes gray like river stone and a quiet steadiness about him. There was something unshaken in him, like he had weathered his own storms and come out the other side. "Name's Cassian Cole," he added. "Folks call me Cass," she swallowed hard. "Madelyn Vance," he nodded once. "You hungry?" Her stomach twisted, not from hunger but from fear. "He will find me, he always does." Cass's jaw tightened. He stood and walked over to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer out. "You come down from the mountains," she nodded. "He chasing you." Madelyn looked away, eyes burning. "He is not the kind of man who lets go. When I told him I was carrying, he locked me in that cabin, said the boy was his blood, not mine. Said I'd never leave with him." Cass crossed back to the bed and crouched beside it. "But you left." "I had to," she said, voice shaking. "When he passed out from the whiskey, I took what I could. I ran." Cass looked at the cradle for a long moment. "You did the right thing." "I do not even know where I was going," she said softly. "I just ran until I saw your barn." "Well," he said, setting a hand lightly on her arm, "you are here now, and he is not." His touch was warm, steady. She had not felt safe in so long. The simple kindness of him undid her. She bit her lip and looked away again. Cass stood and moved to the hearth. "You rest." "I will keep watch." She slept deeply that day, and when she woke, he handed her a bowl of stew and set a cup of warmed milk beside her, already cooled for the baby. Oliver drank without fuss, and Cass watched them both like he had known them for years, not hours. That night, when the baby cried again, Madelyn woke to find Cass already holding him, rocking him gently near the fire. "You did not have to," she whispered. "I did not mind," he said. "He is a good boy." She watched him cradle the baby, watched the way his jaw softened, the way his hands stayed gentle even though they were clearly used to hard work. She had not expected this, the safety, the quiet, the way Cass made the room feel like it could be her home. 2 days passed. Then 4, Cass kept them close to the house. He did not ask questions that made her flinch. He just made space for her grief, her fear, and the small hope that began to take root in her chest. On the 5th morning, she stepped outside with Oliver in her arms. The air was cold but clean. Cass was at the fence line, hammering a loose board. He looked up when he heard her boots on the porch. "Sleep all right?" he asked. She nodded. "Better than I have in months." He set down the hammer and crossed to her. "You are safe here, Madelyn, I swear it, I know," she said. They stood in silence, the baby gurgling softly between them. Then Cass looked at her, really looked. "I do not know what you plan to do next," he said. But if you wanted to stay, you could. She stared at him, heart pounding. You would let me stay? I would want you to, he said, voice low. She blinked hard against tears. He reached out slowly, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. You are not alone anymore. She laid her hand over his. It was not a declaration, not yet, but it was a beginning, and it was real. The earth had begun to thaw in earnest, and with it came the slow rhythm of spring work, mending fence lines, checking calves, turning the soil near the porch for what Cass called a kitchen patch. Madelyn didn't ask to help. She simply picked up a spade when she saw him breaking ground and worked beside him, sleeves rolled just past her wrists, dirt beneath her nails. Oliver lay swaddled in a basket nearby, shaded by a flour sack pinned between two fence posts. Cass glanced over once, watching her press her boot into the spade's edge. You ever worked a patch before? My mother kept one, she answered, pausing to wipe her brow with the back of her hand. I'd help her when I could. She said the growing's in the hands, not the words. He chuckled low. Sounds like someone who knew her way around more than just a garden. She did. Her voice had an edge of quiet reverence. Then she knelt and began pulling up stubborn clumps of dead root. Cass returned to his own row without pressing further. Later, while Oliver slept, she stitched a torn hem on one of Cass's work shirts set aside on the back of a chair. He sat at the table, oiling his saddle in the golden hush before dusk. She glanced up once, the firelight catching the curve of his jaw, and asked, Did you ever have kin nearby? He didn't stop working, but the pause in his answer was long enough to speak for itself. Not anymore, he said at last. My brother passed 3 winters ago. Fever took him fast. We came up here from Missouri after the war. Thought we'd make something quiet of what was left. Madelyn folded the shirt across her lap. Did he have a family? Cass pressed the cloth into the saddle's leather, slow and deliberate. No, just me. He was younger, but always seemed older somehow. He had a mind for books. I had a mind for horses. Somehow we made it work. You've kept it all going. I don't know if I'd call it that, he said, eyes lowering, but I've kept breathing. The room settled into stillness again, save for the soft creak of the cradle as Oliver stirred in his sleep. The next day, Cass brought home a rooster tucked in a wooden crate, its feathers bright against the twilight. He set it down near the shed and called over his shoulder, Figured if that patch of yours takes, you'll want eggs to go with your greens. Madelyn knelt beside the crate, studying the bird. He's loud. Figured you'd say that. She smiled, the first time the corners of her mouth lifted without effort. Cass rubbed the back of his neck. There's a coop behind the barn, needs fixing. Thought maybe we could do it together. We can, she said, and meant it. By the following week, she'd moved from the small bed near the hearth to the extra room off the kitchen. Cass helped her carry Oliver's cradle there, his fingers brushing hers as they lifted it through the narrow doorway. Neither spoke of the shift, but something between them settled more firmly in the quiet afterward. That same night, Madelyn stood by the window, watching the moon rise over the pasture. Cass leaned against the doorframe behind her, arms crossed loosely. You think he'll come? He asked. She didn't turn. He will try. Cass didn't offer promises. Instead, he stepped closer, stopping at her side. There's a rifle under my bed and a shotgun above the door. If he does show, he won't get past the fence. She looked up at him, the silver light softening the lines of his face. You don't even know what he looks like. I know what kind of man he is, Cass said, and I know you. They stood there until Oliver stirred with a hungry cry. Madelyn moved to tend him, arms sure now, movements unhurried. Cass watched her a long moment before stepping out into the darkness, the door shutting soft behind him. Each morning after, she found one more small thing changed. A rail repaired, a new bucket on the well, a clean dress folded near the stove. Cass never mentioned them, and she never asked, but something quiet bloomed between them in those gestures, a care that didn't ask to be seen. When the first green shoots broke the soil in the garden, she knelt beside them, fingertips brushing the leaves like a prayer. Cass came to stand behind her, boots crunching soft on gravel. I never thought I'd plant anything again, she said. Sometimes things grow where you don't expect, he said. She looked up, sunlight catching the edge of his jaw, and said, I think I'm starting to believe that. He held her gaze long and steady and didn't look away. The days had lengthened by the time Cass led Madelyn and the baby to the far pasture, where the cottonwoods leaned toward the creek and the soil turned rich and dark near the bank. He walked ahead, reins in hand, the mule behind him pulling a cart with a broken axle he meant to salvage for lumber. Madelyn followed beside the cart with Oliver in her arms, wrapped snug against her chest in a sling she'd sewn from an old flour sack and strips of muslin. Cass stopped where the high grass gave way to open ground. "Thinking of building a smokehouse out here," he said, resting a hand on the mule's yoke. "Closer to the water, easier to cool meat through summer." Madelyn shifted Oliver's weight against her chest. "You plan it all in your head first." "I do," he said. "Measure it out by thought before I ever lay aboard." She looked out at the space, imagining it. "You ever build one before?" Helped a neighbor back in Clay County. He used river rock for the base, held heat better than pine. She sat on a flat stone, letting the baby sleep. "You don't talk about Missouri much." Cass crouched beside her, picking up a piece of dry grass and rolling it between his fingers. "There wasn't much left of it when we left. My brother wanted somewhere quiet. We found it here. Took most of a year for the land to feel like it didn't belong to someone else." Madelyn watched the creek move in slow ribbons. "It feels like it belongs to you now." "I reckon it does," he said, "but only because I stayed long enough." She looked toward the tree line. "I haven't stayed anywhere in years." Cass didn't ask why. He just leaned back on his hands, letting the sun warm his face. That evening, Madelyn took the clothesline rope and strung it between two posts near the porch. She knelt to scrub Oliver's tiny tunics in a tin basin, her sleeves pushed high, water sloshing over the sides. Cass came up from the barn and watched her for a while in silence, then took a second basin, filled it from the pump, and knelt opposite her. "You don't have to help," she said, wringing out a tunic. "I know," he said, dipping a cloth into the water, "but I want to." The quiet between them was easy now. The kind that came when words weren't needed to prove anything. She passed him a square of lye soap without meeting his eyes. Near the end of the wash, Oliver began to fuss. Madelyn dried her arms and lifted him from the cradle. He squirmed, his cheeks flushed with warmth. She rocked him gently, then looked over her shoulder. "You ever held a baby before him?" Cass stood and wiped his hands on a rag. "I haven't. You wouldn't know it." He stepped closer. "You mind if I take him?" She hesitated only a moment before passing Oliver into his arms. Cass cradled him with care, moving to stand in the shade where the breeze cooled the boy's skin. Oliver quieted, studying Cass with wide eyes. "He trusts you," she said. Cass glanced at her, then back to the child. "He sees the way you look at me. Children pick things up quicker than grown men do." Madelyn lowered her gaze and busied herself with the last of the washing. That night, a low rumble of thunder rolled in from the west. They brought the animals into the smaller barn and shuttered the windows against the wind. Cass lit a single lantern and set it on the table as the sky darkened to iron. Madelyn stood near the hearth with Oliver in her arms. "Storms always made me uneasy." Cass pulled off his hat and hung it by the door. "You're not alone for this one." She didn't answer at once. Instead, she watched Oliver's eyes grow heavy with sleep, then laid him gently in the cradle. The fire popped, casting long shadows across the room. Cass turned toward her. "You've got a way of carrying things," he said. "Like you've been waiting a long while to put them down." Madelyn stepped closer, the storm forgotten. "Maybe I was," she said. His hand found hers, calloused palm warm against her fingers. He didn't pull her to him, just stood there steady as earth, letting her decide. She stepped in. Their foreheads touched first, and then her hand found the space just under his collar where the skin was warm and honest. No words passed between them, but something settled. Not desire, not yet. Something older, a promise that didn't need naming. Outside, the rain began. Inside, she rested her head against his chest, and he folded his arms around her like he'd done it countless times before. And in that quiet, with the storm passing slow overhead, they stood together in the center of a life neither had planned for but both had begun to believe in. By early May, the hills behind the homestead were dappled with wild lupine and sage in bloom. The thaw had settled into the ground fully, and the creek that bordered Cass's western fence ran fast and clear, carrying the last of the snowmelt from the mountains. It was quiet country, but not idle. Each day brought some task that demanded hands and thought. Madelyn had begun to move through those tasks like she belonged to them. There was no moment of decision, no spoken agreement, just a rhythm that found them both. Cass had taken to rising before first light to check the cattle and walk the fence lines, and Madelyn now kept the hearth warm for his return, sometimes with a pan of cornmeal biscuits, sometimes just hot water ready and the baby fed. She stood at the window that morning, watching the edge of the pasture for the sight of him. Oliver dozed in the cradle, one small hand curled around the blanket's edge. Cass returned with a limp in his right leg and a streak of dried blood on his pant leg. She crossed the room before he'd closed the door. "What happened?" "Barbed wire caught me halfway along the north fence. A calf had pushed through and wedged herself in the brush. Took some work to get her free." She knelt beside him, rolling the trouser leg slowly. The gash ran shallow but long, just above the boot line. "You should have come straight back." "I had to finish mending the break. Couldn't leave it open all night." She dipped a rag in the basin and pressed it to the wound without answering. Cass leaned back in the chair, watching her. "You ever set a broken bone?" "I have." "You do it for him?" She didn't look up. "He broke my brother's arm when he came looking for me. I splinted it that night with a willow branch and a torn petticoat." Cass's breath caught faintly. "You've seen more than a person should." She tied off the dressing with firm fingers. "I'd rather see it than live blind to it." Later, she helped him out to the porch where the sun was strong enough to warm the boards. He settled into the rocking chair, his legs stretched out before him. She brought out a basin of peas to shell and sat beside him, the wooden bowl propped between her knees. Cass watched the far hill. "I've been thinking about building a second room off the back. For more storage, for a real bed, one that doesn't sit near the stove or the kitchen. One with space enough for more than one soul." She paused, fingers still against the green pods. "Are you asking me something, Cassian?" "I'm asking if you'd want to stay past spring, if you'd want to plant more than just a patch of greens." She looked at him, her face unreadable. Then she said, "I don't know what a real bed feels like anymore." He turned to her, slow and sure. "It feels like something you don't have to run from." They shelled peas in silence for a while after that, the sun slipping lower behind the ridge. When Oliver woke, she lifted him to her chest and pressed a kiss to his temple. Cass reached over, brushing one knuckle along the boy's arm. "He's watching everything now, like he's memorizing it." Madelyn smiled faintly. "He memorizes voices, too." "I think yours might be his favorite." Cass looked at her then, and whatever answer he might have given was lost in the slow hush between them. That evening she stepped into the barn while Cass fed the mule. The air was thick with the scent of hay and leather. She leaned against the stall post, arms folded. "I've been thinking too," she said. He looked up, brushing dust from his hands. "I don't want to be someone passing through your life. I've done enough passing." Cass stepped toward her, the quiet of the barn wrapping around them. "What do you want?" "I want to raise my son where he can grow straight. I want to wake up without fear, and I want to do that with someone who doesn't flinch from the hard parts." He reached out and she let him take her hands. "Then stay," she nodded once. "I will." Cass brought her hands to his chest, holding them there. "You don't have to keep watch alone anymore, I know." They stood together in the stillness, the horses shifting gently in their stalls, the last light of day spilling through the high window. It was not the end of something, but the beginning of something true, quiet, steady, and theirs. The wedding was quiet. They stood beneath the cottonwoods near the creek, the same place Cass had once traced the earth with plans for a smokehouse. It was May's end, and the air smelled of damp grass and the faint sweetness of early chokecherry. The preacher rode in from 20 miles east, the same man who'd buried Cass's brother years before. He wore a threadbare coat and carried a Bible bound in cracked leather, and he didn't ask for details. Madelyn wore a dress she'd sewn herself from calico that Cass had bartered for in town's soft blue, simple, with small white buttons she'd stitched on by lantern light. Her hair was pulled into a loose twist, tendrils escaping in the breeze. Cass had shaved and worn his best shirt, the one with the mended sleeve she'd sewn weeks earlier. He looked at her like nothing else existed. When he took her hands, his were rough and warm, and they didn't tremble. Oliver slept in a cradle basket beside the tree, watched over by Martha Ellis, the midwife from 2 ridges over who'd come not for duty but affection. When the vows were said, Madelyn didn't cry. She stood with her chin lifted and her gaze steady. Cass's voice was low but sure, and when he kissed her, he framed her face in both hands like she was something sacred. They ate supper on the porch: roast chicken, boiled potatoes, fresh greens from the garden Madelyn had coaxed to life. Martha left before dark, her wagon creaking down the path with a promise to stop by come Sunday. That night, once Oliver was tucked into his cradle and the coals in the hearth had settled to a low glow, Madelyn stood by the window, fingers resting lightly on the sill. Cass came up behind her, sliding his hand along her waist. "You warm enough?" She leaned back into him. "I am." He rested his chin on her shoulder. "You looked beautiful today." "I didn't feel beautiful," she said. "I felt known." Cass turned her to face him. "You are." They didn't rush. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed each knuckle. She traced the scar on his brow, the one he'd gotten breaking a colt 3 springs ago. They undressed each other slowly, reverently, like they were learning a language made of skin and breath. When they lay together, there was nothing hurried or uncertain. It was quiet and deep and whole. Outside, the wind moved through the grass. Inside, she whispered his name like a prayer. Months passed. Summer came hot and dry. The patch of garden grew full squash and beans, corn that reached her waist. Cass built a smokehouse after all, not far from the cottonwoods. Madelyn helped him carry the stones, and Oliver watched from a blanket in the shade, chewing on a piece of leather cord Cass had knotted for him. Cass bought a milk cow from a neighbor and traded fence posts for a second mule. Madelyn learned to churn butter and made a sun hat for Oliver from an old feed sack. He toddled before the first frost, clinging to the porch rail and laughing with his whole chest. One evening, as the air turned crisp and the light fell gold across the hills, Madelyn sat on the porch steps, Oliver curled against her side. Cass came from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "He's asleep." "Almost," she said. "He fought it." Cass settled beside them, knees brushing hers. "I know a little something about that," she smiled. "He's got your stubbornness. He's got your eyes." They sat in silence a while. When the sun dipped low, Cass said, "You ever think about what comes next?" Madelyn adjusted Oliver's blanket. "I used to think I'd never ask that again. Now I think about it every day. I want to build a second barn, maybe take on another pair of hands come spring." She looked at him. "You thinking of growing it?" "I'm thinking of raising him with something he can keep." She laid her head on his shoulder. "Then I'll be right beside you." That first winter, they kept each other warm in more ways than one. The house stayed full of quiet laughter and the crackle of firewood. Cass carved Oliver a wooden horse, and Madelyn made curtains from a bolt of wool she found in a trader's wagon. The days were short but full. By spring, Oliver was walking steady. His first word was Ma, but his second was Cass. They never needed more than what they had. Years later, folks passing through would ask how long they'd been married, and Cass would answer, "Since the land first softened under her step." Madelyn would just smile, her hand resting lightly on his. And every morning she would wake to him beside her, his arm around her waist, the scent of wood smoke and earth in the air. Every evening she would press her lips to his jaw before sleep claimed them. They never spoke of the place she'd run from. It had no hold here. The only thing that grew in their valley now was what they'd planted together: trust and warmth, and a love that asked nothing but presence. And they lived on that land, the 3 of them, through seasons of drought and bloom, hardship and joy, never alone again.